Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the foundational ideas of modern economics by taking a really close look at one of its most influential and, let's be honest, sometimes controversial architects, John Maynard Keynes. We're going to explore how a deeply human, highly emotional concept fundamentally reshaped the way we understand our global financial systems. It's a truly fascinating journey. We're going to travel all the way from the quirky unpredictability of human psychology right up to the grand stage of post-war global architecture.
Okay, let's dive into this. John Maynard Keynes famously noted that most of our decisions can only be taken as a result of animal spirits, of a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction. What Keynes is telling us here is just incredibly profound. He's essentially arguing that the global economy isn't just a giant, perfectly predictable math equation. Actually, scratch that. It's almost the exact opposite. It's fundamentally driven by human emotion, spontaneous optimism, and basically our gut feelings. To get a bit more precise, when we talk about animal spirits in an economic context, we're referring to the instincts, the proclivities, and the emotions that seemingly influence human behavior and drive our decision-making way beyond any rational mathematical calculation. You know when you hear financial analysts on the news talking about consumer confidence? Well, they're essentially trying to measure these animal spirits. It's this unpredictable, completely spontaneous psychology that serves as the hidden engine beneath the entire global financial system.
So, to truly grasp this, here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll start with Part 1, the unpredictable human factor. Then, in Part 2, we're going to look at the great debate over how to fix a crisis. In Part 3, we'll watch these ideas scale way up to designing the global stage. And finally, Part 4, the Keynesian legacy.
Section 1. The unpredictable human factor. To really understand macroeconomics, we first have to understand the human mind.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that Keynes didn't actually invent the phrase animal spirits. It actually has a remarkably long, kind of strange history. Way back in 1543, Bartholomew Treheron used it in a translation of a surgical text. Then, brilliant scientific minds like René Descartes and Isaac Newton used the term to describe the literal physical vitality of the human body. By the time we reach literature, Jane Austen is using it in Pride and Prejudice to describe sheer ebullience and excitement. And over in social science, Karl Marx used it to describe the social interaction and competition among workers in a factory. So this was a phrase that evolved over centuries before it ever touched Wall Street.
It wasn't until 1936 that Keynes formally adapted this long-standing sort of biological and literary concept into a hardcore macroeconomic theory. He published this in his absolute landmark book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Keynes basically took this idea of physical vitality and ebullience and applied it directly to the market. He argued that our positive activities depend much more on spontaneous optimism than on some mathematical expectation. In other words, when business leaders or everyday consumers decide to invest or spend their money, they're usually just relying on their gut feelings and an inherent urge to take action, rather than sitting down and calculating cold, quantitative probabilities.
Which brings us to Section 2, how to fix a crisis. So if our economy is driven by these totally unpredictable animal spirits, what on earth happens when that spontaneous optimism suddenly turns into spontaneous panic? Well, this is where we see a massive, fundamental clash in economic philosophy. Keynesians believe that financial crises arise from a sudden collapse in aggregate demand. Essentially, people just stop spending because their animal spirits turn pessimistic. The solution? Active government stimulus to replace that missing demand. The Austrian school, on the other hand, argues that crises actually result from previous distortions in the economy, usually caused by artificial credit expansion and artificially low interest rates set by central banks. Their solution is minimal intervention. You just have to allow the market to naturally clear out those bad, unproductive investments.
So the crucial point is how wildly differently these two schools view the role of government debt and the actual timeline for recovery. The Keynesian focus argues that running up public debt during a crisis is perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's necessary if it stimulates economic growth and gets people back to work quickly. They prioritize short-term recovery. The Austrian focus, conversely, warns that this debt is incredibly harmful. They argue it creates a massive burden on future generations and misallocates resources. So they prioritize long-term structural health, even if it means enduring some really tough short-term pain. And naturally, each school has some pretty sharp critiques of the other.
Keynesians criticized the Austrian non-interventionist approach, arguing that doing absolutely nothing during a crash just leads to unnecessary human suffering, soaring unemployment, and a painfully slow recovery. Austrians on the other side of the aisle critique the Keynesian model by arguing that government stimulus creates what's called a moral hazard. They believe that if the government constantly bails out failing systems, it just encourages reckless behavior and simply inflates new, even more dangerous economic bubbles for the future. Now, to take this out of the realm of just abstract theory, let's look at how this plays out in the real world. These are crises you likely lived through, things that directly impacted your own wallet. During the 2008 global financial crisis, the Keynesian approach heavily supported the massive stimulus packages and bank bailouts to stabilize the economy. The Austrian approach fiercely criticized this, arguing it merely propped up failing institutions that should have been allowed to collapse. And we saw the exact same debate play out again during the COVID-19 pandemic. Keynesians championed massive fiscal stimuli, like the CARES Act, supporting direct checks to people to prevent total economic collapse. Meanwhile, Austrians warned about the long-term side effects of ballooning government debt and massive market distortions. Now, Keynes's belief in the absolute necessity of active management wasn't just limited to domestic policy, it was international. In a highly pivotal 1933 lecture in Dublin, he warned that the completely free international movement of capital causes what he called capital flight. If money can just flee across borders at the very first sign of trouble, countries are basically forced to artificially keep their interest rates high just to attract that capital back, and that stifles their own domestic prosperity. This fear of global instability directly fueled his desire for massive international structural reform.
Section 3. Designing the global stage.
Following the absolute devastation of the Great Depression and World War II, the world desperately needed a new system to manage these volatile economic forces. So, in July 1944, a truly historic gathering took place. Delegates from 44 nations met at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their goal was unprecedented: to forge a cooperative international monetary system. They wanted to draw on the harsh lessons of the interwar period, specifically aiming to prevent the kind of competitive devaluations and restrictive trade policies that had worsened the global economic collapse in the first place. At Bretton Woods, two massive, competing visions clashed. Representing the British Treasury was the Keynes plan. Consistent with his philosophy, Keynes wanted a powerful global institution called a clearing union. This would feature a brand new international currency called the Bancor, backed by a massive $26 million fund to step in during crises. Contrasting this, representing the U.S. Treasury was a man named Harry Dexter White. White's plan was far more limited. He feared Keynes' union would basically just be used to buy American goods, leaving the U.S. holding all the Bancor. So White proposed a stabilization fund with a much smaller, finite pool of $5 million, utilizing existing national currencies and gold. And this brilliantly illustrates how grand economic theories actually get implemented in the real world, through compromise. The 730 delegates ultimately adopted a structure that was a lot closer to White's plan, but with significant concessions to Keynes's concerns, like raising the total resources up to $8.5 million. Crucially, they created two institutions that still rule the financial world today: the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, to monitor exchange rates, and the World Bank Group to help with post-war reconstruction. They also fixed international currencies to the US dollar and pegged the dollar to gold at $35 an ounce. Let's move to and see how this builds over time. The Bretton Woods system was born in 1944, and the IMF was formalized in 1945. By 1958, the system became fully functional with convertible currencies. However, the system had a pretty fatal flaw. The U.S. had the sole responsibility of keeping the dollar fixed to gold. Eventually, persistent U.S. balance of payments deficits meant there were suddenly more foreign-held dollars out there than the U.S. actually had in gold reserves. The system just couldn't hold. So in 1971, President Richard Nixon was basically forced to end the dollar's convertibility to gold, effectively ending the pure Bretton Woods era. Which leads us to Section 4, the Keynesian legacy. Even though the gold standard of Bretton Woods ended, the institutions it created remain deeply, deeply embedded in our world today. And contemporary economists are still actively grappling with Keynes's foundational ideas. In their 2009 book, Animal Spirits, economists George Akerlof and Robert J. Schiller write, "The proper role of the government is to set the stage. The stage should give full rein to the creativity of capitalism, but it should also countervail the excesses that occur because of our animal spirits." I think this perfectly summarizes the enduring Keynesian perspective. Capitalism is an incredibly creative, vital force, but because it's driven by human emotion and spontaneous optimism, it is inherently unstable, and it requires a steadying hand. Which leaves us with a massive, lingering question to consider as we wrap up. Can our modern global economy, with all of its super complex institutions and high-tech mathematical models, ever truly tame our animal spirits? Or, simply because we are inherently human, are we destined to forever cycle between spontaneous optimism and unpredictable crisis? It's a debate that rages on to this very day, and I want to know where you stand. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this, so please debate your answer in the comments below.